Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. David Pick joins me to talk about cognition and familiarity bias. David has been experimenting with cognition for over 35 years, and currently he's working on a hypothesis that when we are not consciously trying to weigh alternative options and trying to be objective, that we fall back on something that he calls familiarity bias. In other words, if nothing else is influencing us, we go with what is most familiar. This is something that might impact us when we're making decisions during political campaigns. For instance, often the candidate with the most name recognition gets elected, not necessarily the person who ran the best campaign or made the best arguments. Also, something that impacts purchasing, and so it's a marketing issue, and maybe even impact us when we're dating and doing other things. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. David Pick. Dr. Pick has been researching cognition for approximately 35 years, and I'd like to talk to him today about some of the experiments he's doing. But first, David, tell us about this quote. David gave me a quote, and it says, "A reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. Authoritarian institutions and marketers have always known this fact." And the quote is from Daniel Kahneman, a fellow researcher. Tell us what context this is referring to.
Well, I don't really consider him a fellow researcher because he won the Nobel Prize. But
Okay.
anyway, he has spent a career developing something that's come to be called behavioral economics. He got the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on decision making. Traditional economic theory would say that we maximize our benefits and minimize our losses. In psychology, that'd be a very behavioristic view,
Sure.
with punishments and reinforcements and whatnot. And what he's demonstrated, along with Amos Tversky, who didn't share the prize because he didn't live long enough, it demonstrated that's not the way we make decisions. We make decisions on the basis of biases. And some of these biases run through the phylogenetic scale. In other words, not just us,
Right.
assuming we're at the top, but down through the scale.
So when we vote in presidential elections, when we are hiring someone after doing a couple interviews, when we're choosing what product to buy, you're saying that there are
a number of different biases. Another one I've been
biases that are influencing our decisions that we're not aware of, right?
Yes.
And that these aren't just cultural biases, and they're not even just human bias. They're actually something that runs through
down at least as far as horses, as far as I know.
That's pretty interesting. Okay, so for example.
Well, people wonder why anybody puts a yard sign out to promote their election.
Sure.
But it's another application of this familiarity bias. If an individual has name recognition, as they call it, and somebody, an uninformed voter, let's say, goes in and votes even though they don't know who they're voting for. If there's one candidate who's familiar and there's another candidate who isn't familiar, let's say in the same party in a primary, they're going to take the familiar one if they vote at all.
Well, now, sometimes we don't always follow what's the familiar bias, of course,
Sure.
right? I mean, so
Sure.
that we do, intellectually override
Sure.
this from time to time.
Right.
So, am I correct in saying that your argument is essentially that this bias influences us often, not necessarily all the time, right?
Right.
Yes. Okay. And so, how do you experiment with horses, for instance?
All right.
To
Right.
explore this?
Well, the first time I observed it in horses, I wasn't expecting it and I couldn't explain it. It was 30 years ago when people thought horses and most domestic animals were totally colorblind. So I was doing an experiment, and it took me about a year.
I've heard that,
Yeah.
you know, my dog was colorblind and
Sure.
et cetera, right?
Well, most often they're not black and white colorblind. They're dichromats, as we say.
Okay.
Like colorblind humans who can really see some colors. But
Right.
yeah. But anyway, so I spent about a year training this horse to discriminate between various shades of blue and various shades of gray, various intensities, reflectance values.
Well, how did you do that?
Well, I had a two-choice apparatus.
This isn't one of those deals where the horse has to go like this.
No,
Okay.
none of that. But anyway, so I had a starting post and a choice about 10 feet away on both sides, a blue panel versus a gray panel. And like there were 5 different reflectance values of gray with matching blues, and they're alternating on sides, okay?
Yeah.
So the horse was at a starting post at the base of the T, and when it was released, if it went to the correct side, the side with the blue wavelength, it would get just a sprinkling of Farmer Brown's oats feed. Okay?
Great, yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah. Anyway.
Like Dewey's Pizza for a horse, right?
Yeah, oh man, they'd go for it for sure. But anyway, so that sounds very simple. It was tedious. Color doesn't mean much to a horse. I think it's easier to train him to ride.
Right.
Anyway, so after about a year, I could demonstrate in a double-blind situation where any time blue was present versus gray, it would go to blue. Okay, my criteria.
Regardless of what the reward was?
Oh, the reward was always for blue.
Oh, I see. Okay, sure.
And if it went to gray, it
Yeah.
just had to wait an extra minute before
Yeah.
another trial started, which is something this horse that I have in mind did not
Okay.
care for. Okay, you might even say it was punished to go to gray.
Yeah.
Okay, so I had randomized sequences with all these various intensities, and I had matching greens and reds to the blues. So I thought I'd just substitute the values of the reds for the blues, okay? And I wouldn't have to shape this behavior. Mm-hmm. Well, the first 20 times this particular horse had a choice between red and gray. Red it hadn't seen before, and gray it had seen an awful lot. It went to gray.
Ah.
Why?
Yeah.
There isn't a learning theory in the world that would predict that, okay? And
Right, because if anything, you've demonstrated to the horse that it will get punished if it goes to gray, right?
You might
So
say
the
that,
only reason
yeah.
it would go to gray would be familiarity.
Well, that didn't cross my mind until I read Kahneman's book 20 years later.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
I didn't publish those results, but I did replicate it more recently
Yeah.
with a horse. And I didn't
And you replicated it.
replicate it with a probability of 0.0175, something. It wasn't 20 times in a row,
Right,
but
right.
it was still very statistically significant.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I remember in my research in my rhetoric field, I was looking at the Nixon campaign in 1968, and Nixon had run for president, of course, in '60 and lost, and then ran for governor of California, I think in '62, and lost. And he was, the party put him up in '68 to run again, and they hired an advertising executive named Joe McGinnis to run the campaign. And McGinnis's theory was that since Nixon didn't fare well in debates and interactions with the news media, that they would use the advertising campaign that they had used for Ivory soap. So, and the idea was that they were selling Ivory soap as your mother's soap, the familiar product, right? Mm-hmm. And so they were presenting Nixon as the familiar candidate, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that was he wrote a whole book on this called The Making of the President. Essentially, he was saying we sold somebody as a president of the United States running on the familiarity principle.
Yeah. Well, one of the founders, you might call him, of behaviorism in psychology, J.B. Watson, actually got kicked out of psychology, graduate student involved. But anyway,
right.
he got a job at an ad agency, and he worked for Ivory Soap.
Oh, really?
According to urban legend, he's the reason that it floats.
Oh, no kidding.
Really?
Yeah. But it doesn't have anything to do with this theory, though.
No. The people
All
have
right.
been thinking about this for a long time. They really have.
Yeah. Well, so, okay, so there's a familiarity bias that is that runs through horses, and you're saying you're experimenting right now with what?
Goldfish.
With goldfish. This is pretty bizarre. Okay. So how do you run this test with goldfish?
Well, we haven't actually done it yet. I need to get approval by Animal Care and Use Committee in West Lafayette after they approve my protocol. But the protocol, the procedure.
Yeah. How much do these goldfish cost you?
They're 30 cents a piece.
Okay. And you got to get approval for what you do with them?
They're animals.
Okay, good. All right, go ahead. So how's this work?
Okay. So basically, I'm going to give these goldfish a two-color choice. Goldfish have excellent color vision.
Oh, really?
They're tetrachromats. They have 4 different kinds of counts instead of just 3 like us.
And we have 3. Yeah.
We have 3. Some women have 4.
Right.
Anyway, they're a good subject to replicate this horse study. Okay, not using a T-shaped apparatus, but still a two-choice apparatus. Now, when my students and I and Rob Halleck finish with the apparatus, we'll have a flashing yellow light at one end of a 1.5 gallon aquarium.
Yeah.
Okay, with a motion sensor.
Right.
And at the other end will be red, green, or blue LEDs, under which are motion sensors, and above which on both sides will be a pellet dispenser.
I knew there was food involved.
Got to be food. Okay,
Yeah.
and they're not going to be food deprived. Goldfish are voracious eaters.
Right.
Okay, so anyway, when my students are also learning to program in Python on a Raspberry Pi 0W. Okay, this is a computer that's half the size of a credit card. Has excellent I/O capabilities. Kids build robots using these things.
So what's going to happen?
Okay, what's going to happen is this is going to be a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week thing for a goldfish in a tank. They swim up to the yellow flashing light, and that turns on a choice. Okay, the flashing light goes off, and one or the other of the 2 lights, let's say red or green, come on. They swim to the correct one. Half the fish would have green, half would have red. Okay,
right.
And when they approach it, both lights go off. Pellet drops above where the light was. Okay,
right.
3 minutes later, flashing strobe light comes on again.
Right.
So they do this as much.
It's a miniature version of the horse experiment.
Basically, only automated.
Right,
okay?
right.
So when they have all
nobody gets bit.
Nobody is hurt in this experiment.
Yeah. Okay.
So when the fish have experience and demonstrate the ability to discriminate between these two, then we will replace the positive stimulus, the one that's previously reinforced, with blue, something they've never seen before.
Right.
And the other one will be something that they're familiar with.
Right.
And we fully expect those fish to go to the familiar one.
Even though they should have been trained to not go to it because it didn't give them what they wanted.
Nothing there.
Yeah. That's very interesting. So let's take this back to human beings now.
Sure.
What happens? Why is it that we're not always intellectually engaged in thinking, I want to do this, this is what I need to do, I've analyzed the situation, this is the best decision?
Sure.
Why is it that we're not always functioning like that? Why is it that we might fall back on something as primitive as familiarity bias?
As a heuristic, a rule of thumb, just think about the amount of time it takes to make that decision, okay? It takes a lot of calories, actually. Our brain burns a lot of calories.
Right.
And if you have to make a decision suddenly, you don't have the time for it, you rely on these kinds of heuristics or rules of thumb. Mm-hmm. So to me, in thinking about this, I mean, what's the neurological basis of for this? Why would a goldfish and a horse and a person behave in the same way, operating on this bias? Yeah. When people think about how our memories are constructed, let's say neurologically with neurons, we generally talk about associative networks.
Okay, associative network.
Right, where the more often a particular path between neurons is followed, the stronger the connections get. Okay. And this takes repetition. Now,
this is why if you want to remember something from your 6th grade classroom experience and it's something obscure, you might try to start by remembering something that's more familiar to you, right? Like the bicycle you had when you were in sixth
just
grade,
anything that puts you in that
mean
context.
look that the teacher was giving you, or something like that, right? Yeah, and then you would branch out from that and get to the other memories, right?
Yeah. And it would extend to memories for meaning as well. When studying for a test, the best way to remember what you're going to be expected to produce in a test is to form connections, meaningful connections between concepts, so you know how things tie together. So when one node, as they say, gets activated, it spreads out and activates other memories, other facts.
This is why they tell you when you're working on your dissertation to turn it into an elevator speech, and every time somebody asks you what you're working on, to explain it to them.
Very good.
Right?
Yeah. Well, you've heard the 10,000-hour rule, too.
Right.
Yeah. Repetition, even just rote repetition.
Yeah.
A rote repetition is really a brute force way. It's in humans. I don't think goldfish have that capability to the extent we do to override these sorts of biases. But yeah, we can do that.
So let's define heuristic for our viewers here.
Well, I mean, technically, it's in everyday parlance, it's a rule of thumb. It's something that solves a problem. Most of the time, doesn't always work.
And we think of heuristic in opposition to what? To
an algorithm, something that guarantees a solution, but takes quite a bit more time.
Okay, or we would just say rationality, maybe, right? I mean, if we would say, when we say we expect that we're reasoning something out, we're weighing two sides to the argument. That's a bit of a process, maybe not an algorithm.
An algorithm, and that the closest relationship to an algorithm there would be an MBA, making a decision. You can never get enough information.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
There comes a time when you have to make a decision, and a decision is made reluctantly. With an algorithm, you may never find all possible solutions. Well, you play chess. You play chess well. Yeah. Think about going through every possible move that you might make in response to somebody else's.
Well, and that's the problem with playing computers, right? I mean, they just have an infinite amount of calculations that they can make in a few seconds, and it's just...
Oh, sure, but those are humans programming those computers, too.
Well, so, David, let's say you find out that this is true. I mean, do we, should we all be aware of this? Should we be guarding against this heuristic tendency, or is heuristic decision-making something that's a necessary part of our existence?
I think so. I think we should. I don't know if we should go on a campaign as such.
Yeah. Should we outlaw familiarity campaigns for political office, maybe?
No. Well, I think it's good to know those things are operating in a political context, especially when it comes to autocrats. And the sorts of control exercised over people in blatant opposition to the truth and reality.
Yeah. Well, and so actually the quote that I was reading a minute ago, he said that authoritarian institutions and marketers have always known this. Mm-hmm. What do you think he had in mind?
Well, he wrote that before Donald Trump. So it wasn't just the present situation that he was thinking about. I just think of Hitler and his campaign. I mean, that propaganda is another. It's a pejorative for advertising, basically. Mm-hmm. They were intuitive advertisers. Repetition was a key element. Anywhere in the world you go today, there's going to be Coca-Cola.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
If you're looking for a soft drink somewhere, that may be the first thing to come to mind, especially if you don't have an existing preference.
Right.
I mean, it can get to the extent where, well, there are other reasons for this as well. In the South, if you want a pop or a soda, as they say out east, you want a Coke.
Right.
Can I have an orange Coke?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or a strawberry Coke?
There might not be a Coke at all. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Well, so what, you know, how do we apply this? I guess, you know, the thing that comes to mind for me is I was running a campaign for someone who was running for sheriff in Will County, Illinois. And there was a man named Stan Wasnes who was on the township board of directors. And when Wasnes ran his campaigns, and Wasnes had been in office for, I don't know, 25, 30 years, he put out signs that just had his last name on them 3 times. So you'd look at this sign, and it wouldn't say Wasnes for, you know, township clerk or something. It would just say Wasnes, Wasnes, Wasnes. It was one sign, and then he would spread these signs all over town, right? So when I was running this campaign for sheriff, I had a meeting with the staff and the campaign staff. I was doing the communication side of it. And I said, okay, we need to talk about the sign. And they're like, we want to do what Stan Wasnes does. And I'm like, what's that? They go, well, you know, we want to say Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald on the signs. And I said, no, I don't think we're going to do that. But, you know, now that I'm talking to you, I think maybe Wasnes was running a more sophisticated campaign than we were. I think
Who won that race?
Wasnes always won. I don't think he ever lost a race. And
Wasnes,
we won one and
Wasnes,
lost one in the
is that
Fitzgerald
right?
campaign. So maybe I should have switched over.
Repetition, I'm telling you.
Yeah. Well, so so we can use seriously. We can use the repetition to help us a lot, and with students when they're studying, of course, right? And then on the other hand, we need to guard against it, right? Because it's going to create a sense of familiarity. Which, what is that? You know, I mean, if you look at this as cognition, there's an emotional connection to this. I mean, where does it go? Why does familiarity draw us in? Why aren't we opposed to familiarity? Why are we attracted to familiarity?
I'm not sure, but maybe it's the devil you know versus the one you don't.
Yeah.
I don't know. People go to the same place on vacation all the time, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So do you think we're deluded? You know, do you think that we all think that we're smarter and more careful and selective than we really are?
I think those of us who think about it think that. But I think a lot of people just don't think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, if you're thoughtful, you can override this sort of bias.
Of course.
But if you're not thoughtful, if you're not deliberate in decision making, you're going to be more susceptible to it. I think this is really what we need to do in our educational system. What did Thomas Jefferson say about democracy and education? Now, I'm not going to quote him perfectly by any means, but as to my understanding, he said that what it would take to maintain a democracy was an educated electorate.
Right.
So let's start in first grade, or even better yet, in preschool.
Yeah.
Educating our kids.
Yeah.
And producing children who are thoughtful. Not all of them are going to be good at math, and not all of them are going to be good at music, and most of them won't be good writers.
Yeah.
But we can train them, I think, to think.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the most interesting things that I'm taking out of this is that when we don't ask ourselves to become objective and look at things carefully, that we don't have a vacuum.
Right.
That we're working from. We actually have a tendency that's there, that's a hidden tendency that's always going to be there.
Excellent.
To go for what's familiar.
Yeah.
And so it's maybe necessary to ask ourselves sometimes questions before we make decisions.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, David. Well, thank you for being on the show, and be interested in knowing the result of your goldfish experiments.
I'll let you know firsthand.
When you come up with that. How long will this last?
Well, we should be finished in a year.
Okay. Well, we'll have David back. That is all the time we have on our program. Thank you to Dr. David Pick for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.